I'm just going to be talking a little bit about how I run tabletop role-playing game adventures. There will be spoilers for my self-published adventure module, Skirfir's Mine, so if you think you're going to be a player in that adventure, then you might want to skip this. On the other hand, if you think you're going to be running that as a dungeon master or game master, this could be helpful to you in that I do sort of explain how I intend it to be run. The first thing I need to discuss is the kind of campaign that I prefer and try to run. And I'm not saying that other approaches are wrong or that you can't have fun with them, but that's not how I like a campaign to be run. It's not the kind of campaign I'm usually interested in. But it is a different approach from most campaigns today, the more modern type of campaign. It is not a pre-planned, story-driven campaign where everything fits together and where the campaign is planned to end after defeating a big bad end-game boss. Instead, it is an open-ended campaign which lasts as long as people are able to get together and continue to enjoy it. Rather than a pre-planned story, it's made up as you go, with adventures that are not necessarily related to each other. That isn't to say nothing carries over. Things could carry over from one adventure to another, especially if the players find them entertaining. But multiple sessions, each effectively their own short adventure, might not share the same setting, the same dungeon, or whatever. Or that there might not even be a sort of adventure path, or several different adventure paths that show up inside it. But the campaign as a whole is not a pre-planned adventure path. It is something that is open-ended, ongoing, and made up as you go, with the game master and the players playing off each other. Essentially the game master adapting to and playing off whatever the players enjoy and the way their characters develop as you play. Stories are emergent and created as much by the players as by the game master. That is, it doesn't tell a story so much as it creates a story at the table that can be told afterward. The campaign itself isn't so much a story as it is a world or a version of a world or a timeline. This is fairly typical of early D&D, where even if you played published adventure modules, you would find yourself jumping between adventures that were not actually related to each other. In this way, it largely ignores the Hickman revolution of the mid-'80s, in which under the influence of designers Laura and Tracy Hickman, among others, role-playing games shifted from being primarily location-based sandboxes and moved toward a more story-oriented approach. This is important to understand because when it comes to running adventures, that is the context in which those adventures exist, and influences how they are designed and run. For most of the rest of this, I'm going to be talking about my self-published adventure module, Skirfir's Mine, as a pretty good example of my overall design philosophy and approach to game mastering. Skirfir's Mine is a kind of mini mega dungeon I originally created for my sister's family, and later decided to share publicly. It is a level 1 through 4 sandbox designed to be used with Frank Mincer's 1985 D&D basic set, the famous red box with the dragon and the warrior, or the 1991 D&D Rules Cyclopedia, though it could also be used with the BX or with various OSR retro clones that follow the same or similar rules. And I'll leave a link in the description for anyone who wants to download the PDF or perhaps purchase the printed version I created for those who would like a hard copy and don't want to use up a ton of paper and probably multiple ink cartridges printing out the PDF. And I will go ahead and warn you that it is not exactly edited well, in fact, so badly that the title is misspelled on the cover. But I can't afford to hire an editor, especially for something that I am giving away. The first thing to understand about Skirfir's Mine is that it is a self-contained sandbox. And by sandbox, I simply mean that it doesn't have any explicitly defined objectives. So no, I don't simply mean that the player characters can try to do whatever the players want. That's implicit in the game. And I certainly don't mean that it's an open world. It is a small, self-contained sandbox in the form of a large dungeon. Rather, I mean that other than the game's implied goals of gaining treasure and XP to level up and become more powerful, it doesn't actually have an implied objective, but instead allows the players to choose and even change the objectives for their characters. For example, my sister's family started out as treasure hunters, simply looking to get as much loot as they could. However, after an encounter with some hobgoblin taskmasters with whips, overseeing some enslaved goblin children, and a previous throwaway line about beating them, they've now taken it as their mission to take down the hobgoblins for child abuse and liberate the oppressed goblins. While I do have plans for a shorter adventure with an implied objective to rescue a certain NPC once they're done with Skirfir's mine and before moving on to probably an island sandbox, sandboxes like this are what I usually prefer as adventures, especially for larger ones. So having established that the dungeon is intended to be a self-contained sandbox, let's move on to more of the specifics of the design. The dungeon has 3 main levels and a small 4th level. Each of the main levels uses 3 to 5 sheets of graph paper, with a total of 12 for the 3 main levels and then a 13th for the smaller 4th level, which is somewhat hidden. It has 301 numbered rooms, though probably between 400 and 500 rooms if you count areas labeled as sub-rooms or multiple small rooms sharing a single number. Each sheet of graph paper was designed to have about enough content for 1 or maybe 2 expeditions into the dungeon, each of which would be 1 play session typically. And each is also designed to have enough XP for 1/4 of a level up, so about every 4 trips to the dungeon, the player characters should gain a level. The dungeon is also divided into various zones with different themes. This is a variation of some common advice you will hear to have themed levels. Something you also often see in video games where you may have a sewer level or a water level or an ice level. However, rather than combining it to levels, I instead went for zones. Some of the small zones, such as the crypts, markets, infirmary, and foundry, are found entirely on 1 level, and confined to 1 sheet of graph paper, or part of one. While some of the large zones, such as the former dwarven residences and the mines proper, extend vertically across several levels. All levels contain multiple zones, except arguably the 4th level, though even that has 2 distinct areas, more mine-like and more cave-like, so it too could be said to have 2 zones. This allows the players to experience more variety within a single level, while also providing continuity when they revisit previously visited zones on new levels. And each zone gets its own inhabitants, its own theming, and is designed with maps that fit what they're supposed to be, such as the residences resembling a kind of town or village, the mine shafts being laid out in a way that makes sense for mine shafts, and so on. Treasure was also varied, with plenty of the typical gold coins, gems, jewels that you would expect to find, but also some more interesting and varied treasures. The brigands at the entrance, for example, have a cart they had stolen from a traveling merchant containing things such as fine silks and fine spices, which they hoped to sell to the hobgoblins, while a closet adjoining the old dwarven throne room contains ornate weapons, functionally identical to normal weapons, but worth 10 times the price as they are effectively art objects, and actually representing quite a haul for low-level adventurers finding them. The dungeon, of course, contains various puzzles and tricks. While most traps are designed as puzzle traps with various ways to defeat them, a little like a text adventure or an escape room. When designing these traps, I made a point to think through various ways that the player characters could plausibly defeat the trap, while also remaining open to the possibility the players themselves may come up with other reasonable ideas to defeat them. Thus, I made sure the traps could be overcome, and overcome in multiple ways, but I do not necessarily demand that the player characters use one of those specific ways, as long as they come up with something that is plausible. To facilitate exploration, player agency, and help improve the sandbox feel further, all the levels are highly non-linear. Every area and sheet of graph paper is designed with loops and branching paths and a generally nonlinear design. In addition, all areas of graph paper have at least one and usually multiple connection to the neighboring areas, meaning you can move around between areas in a long linear way. There are also multiple paths up and down between the levels, with most areas, including all large areas, containing one or more routes to the levels below and above. In this way, it's very similar to what in video gaming might be called a Metroidvania, but without the need to unlock the connections in most cases. Lastly, I make extensive use of the reaction roll system found in early D&D. So the reactions of most creatures to the player characters is not predefined. Going into it, I don't even know how most of them react, since it is up to a die roll. For those not familiar with the reaction roll systems of early D&D, it's a 2d6 roll in which only on a roll of 2 do they immediately attack. So very rarely will creatures immediately attack the player characters when they see them, but conversely, very rarely will they be immediately friendly. They'll end up somewhere in between most of the time and give the player characters a chance to influence the direction the encounter will take. It is also designed with multiple factions with their own interests. There are the hobgoblins, which are essentially the dominant monsters of the main mine. Then there are the goblins, which are largely subservient to them. A secondary entrance leading into level 2 also contains a Neanderthal lair, where the player characters could find allies or at least a place where they're sheltered from the evil humanoids. There are actually 5 such factions, as well as, of course, numerous one-off monsters inhabiting odd corners of the dungeon. These factions allow for the player characters to select enemies, form alliances, or to play the factions against each other. So, how do you actually run this adventure? And it's really designed for the Dungeon Master to get a gist of the situation and wing it. It's all about reacting to the players and their choices and improvising accordingly. This means constantly thinking about how the world will react to what they do and making those things happen. Whenever the players make a decision and do a thing, stopping to think what the logical consequences of that action would be and applying those effects to the world. When interacting with monsters beyond the initial reaction rolls, this means role-playing the monsters as you understand them and having them react as characters in their own right, according to who and what they actually are. Overall, running a tabletop role-playing game amounts to playing as the world, improvising, and making adjustments as you go. This can include making changes to the dungeon itself between adventures based on what the logical effects of the player character's actions in the last session would be. For example, in Area 1, there is a band of brigands who want to sell some plundered merchandise to the hobgoblins. 2 of these are waiting just outside the dungeon, guarding their loot, while a third is in an old conference room, waiting for a representative of the hobgoblins to negotiate a price. However, when our group played the adventure, the player characters killed the 2 brigands at the entrance. Then they took a route through the first area that did not take them to the conference room, but instead to an old guard area, in which they had an unfortunate encounter with some sturges in which the dice hated them and they nearly died and had to retreat. Now, it doesn't make a whole lot of big sense that the other 2 brigands, the ones waiting in the conference room, will just sit there forever waiting. For our next session, I ignored the literal time in the real world between my visits when we played the game, and instead that they came back around a week or so later, long enough for their injuries to heal. They arrived to find that the other 2 brigands, the ones they never actually met, had come back to the entrance, seen their comrades dead, and assumed that the hobgoblins had double-crossed them, and so went through other parts of the first area, killing who they could before being killed themselves, in an act of revenge. While this did remove a few monsters and thus some challenge, it created an interesting narrative that was also believable and thoroughly rooted in the situation I had originally devised. The players loved it, and even the one remaining, though badly wounded brigand, to temporarily join them before sacrificing him to some sturges to get them out of the way. I didn't anticipate any of this when I was designing the dungeon. There is nothing written down suggesting it, but this was the logical outcome, or at least one logical outcome, of the player character's actions. And that's what running a tabletop adventure is all about. Reacting to the players, adjudicating their actions, improvising when necessary, and making adjustments to the world to reflect what they do. So, my philosophy on tabletop game mastering could be summed up as: you start by designing a setting and situation. Not a story, but an interesting setting and situation, with the story being created collaboratively at the table between all involved, the players and the game master, with the game master's job being to react to the players while also adjudicating the rules as necessary. The game master's job is essentially an odd mix of referee and entertainer, and that's something that is important to stress and remember. The game master is not an antagonist the players are trying to beat, because I know there are some who imagine that. The game master is actually more of an entertainer, trying to facilitate an interesting adventure, and in doing so, allow everyone to have a good time playing the game. So that is what you could call my tabletop game mastering philosophy in a nutshell. There is something of an addendum I'd like to add, and that is how this relates to video games, since most of the videos I put here have been about video games, and in particular how it relates to another one of my videos where I talk about story in RPG video games. Because really, in my ideal RPG video game, this is the kind of thing you'd be trying to emulate. And that is the real purpose of nonlinear stories in RPG video games. One of the great advantages of tabletop RPGs over their video game counterparts is that the player characters can do anything, or at least they can try to do anything. Anything the players can think of, their characters can at least try to do. They may not succeed, and of course, you could have a player think of something ridiculous that they couldn't possibly do, but they can at least try it, and they can do anything that their characters reasonably could do. That's not actually my favorite thing about tabletop role-playing games. The number one reason I prefer them is actually that they make great social activities in ways that video games simply can't. Not even online multiplayer video games, and certainly not single-player video games. But it is my second favorite thing about them, or, it's up there. It's one of the best things about them. That is not something you can have in a video game where things have to be pre-scripted. Video games cannot improvise a reaction to an unexpected player choice. Video games require actions to be limited to what exists within hard-coded rules anyway, and they require dialogues to be pre-written not only for NPCs but also the player characters. So really, there isn't a whole lot of room even to make unusual choices in many instances with a video game. And a video game certainly can't improvise narrative reactions to unexpected narrative choices, even if hypothetically there was a way for the players to make them. Having a branching, nonlinear, choose-your-own-ending-like story is one way a video game can partially emulate this, at least for the more common or likely player choices. And so the developer should think through what kind of choices the player is likely to make. Look for places they could take different paths or make different choices, and then think through the consequences of those. In that way, it wouldn't be that different from reacting to choices, perhaps unexpected choices, by a player in a tabletop game. The big difference is the developer has to think in advance of things a player might choose in order to give the options in the first place, and then, as a second step, think through the consequences and effects of those actions. And most video games don't really do that good a job of it. They either don't really do it all, stay pretty linear, or they have only limited choices. And I try not to judge too much for that because I know it's a lot of extra work for the developers. Not everyone has the time or the budget or whatever to do that. But when I do see it, I do like to give kudos to those developers that do include the branching, nonlinear choices along with appropriate consequences and ultimately differing outcomes based on those choices. But when it comes to what I had to say about story and RPG video games in my previous video, this is the lens to look through it to really understand what I'm getting at. So, for anyone who's made it to the end, thanks for listening. I hope you found it interesting and thought-provoking, and have a great rest of your day. Goodbye.